Chapter 5. She went on Thursdays. She got up and dressed silently, in order not to awaken Charles, who would have made remarks about her getting ready too early. Next she walked up and down, went to the windows, and looked out at the place. The early dawn was broadening between the pillars of the market, and the chemist's shop, with the shutters still up, showed in the pale light of the dawn the large letters of his signboard. When the clock pointed to 7:15, she went off to the Lion d'Or, whose door Artemis opened yawning. The girl then made up the coals covered by the cinders, and Emma remained alone in the kitchen. Now and again she went out. Hibbert was leisurely harnessing his horses, listening, moreover, to Mère Françoise, who, passing her head and nightcap through a grating, was charging him with commissions and giving him explanations that would have confused anyone else. Emma kept beating the soles of her boots against the pavement of the yard. At last, when he had eaten his soup, put on his cloak, lighted his pipe, and grasped his whip, he calmly installed himself on his seat. The Hirondelle started at a slow trot, and for about a mile stopped here and there to pick up passengers who waited for it, standing at the border of the road in front of their yard gates. Those who had secured seats the evening before kept it waiting. Some even were still in bed in their houses. Hibbert called, shouted, swore, then he got down from his seat and went and knocked loudly at the doors. The wind blew through the cracked windows. The 4 seats, however, filled up. The carriage rolled off. Rows of apple trees followed one upon another, and the road between its 2 long ditches, full of yellow water, rose, constantly narrowing towards the horizon. Emma knew it from end to end. She knew that after a meadow there was a signpost, next an elm, a barn, or the hut of a lime-kiln tender. Sometimes even, in the hope of getting some surprise, she shut her eyes, but she never lost the clear perception of the distance to be traversed. At last the brick houses began to follow one another more closely. The earth resounded beneath the wheels. The Hirondelle glided between the gardens, where through an opening one saw statues, a periwinkle plant, clipped yews, and a swing. Then on a sudden the town appeared, sloping down like an amphitheater, and drowned in the fog. It widened out beyond the bridges confusedly. Then the open country spread away with a monotonous movement till it touched in the distance the vague line of the pale sky. Seen thus from above, the whole landscape looked immovable. As a picture, the anchored ships were massed in one corner. The river curved round the foot of the green hills, and the isles, oblique in shape, lay on the water, like large, motionless, black fishes. The factory chimneys belched forth immense brown fumes that were blown away. At the top, one heard the rumbling of the foundries, together with the clear chimes of the churches that stood out in the mist. The leafless trees on the boulevards made violet thickets in the midst of the houses, and the roofs, all shining with the rain, threw back unequal reflections according to the height of the quarters in which they were. Sometimes a gust of wind drove the clouds towards the St. Catherine hills, like aerial waves that broke silently against a cliff. A giddiness seemed to her to detach itself from this mass of existence, and her heart swelled as if the 120,000 souls that palpitated there had all at once sent into it the vapor of the passions. She fancied theirs. Her love grew in the presence of this vastness, and expanded with tumult to the vague murmurings that rose towards her. She poured it out upon the square, on the walks, on the streets, and the old Norman city outspread before her eyes as an enormous capital, as a Babylon into which she was entering. She leaned with both hands against the window, drinking in the breeze. The 3 horses galloped, the stones grated in the mud, the diligence rocked, and Hibbert, from afar, hailed the carts on the road, while the bourgeois who had spent the night at the Guillaume woods came quietly down the hill in their little family carriages. They stopped at the barrier. Emma undid her overshoes, put on other gloves, rearranged her shawl, and some 20 paces farther she got down from the Hirondelle. The town was then awakening. Shop boys in caps were cleaning up the shop fronts, and women with baskets against their hips, at intervals, uttered sonorous cries at the corners of streets. She walked with downcast eyes, close to the walls, and smiling with pleasure under her lowered black veil. For fear of being seen, she did not usually take the most direct road. She plunged into dark alleys and, all perspiring, reached the bottom of the Rue Nationale, near the fountain that stands there. It is the quarter for theaters, public houses, and whores. Often a cart would pass near her, bearing some shaking scenery. Waiters in aprons were sprinkling sand on the flagstones between green shrubs. It all smelt of absinthe, cigars, and oysters. She turned down a street. She recognized him by his curling hair that escaped from beneath his hat. Leon walked along the pavement. She followed him to the hotel. He went up, opened the door, entered. What an embrace! Then, after the kisses, the words gushed forth. They told each other the sorrows of the week, the presentiments, the anxiety for the letters, but now everything was forgotten. They gazed into each other's faces with voluptuous laughs and tender names. The bed was large, of mahogany, in the shape of a boat. The curtains were in red levantine that hung from the ceiling and bulged out too much towards the bell-shaped bedside, and nothing in the world was so lovely as her brown head and white skin standing out against this purple color, when, with a movement of shame, she crossed her bare arms, hiding her face in her hands. The warm room, with its discreet carpet, its gay ornaments, and its calm light, seemed made for the intimacies of passion. The curtain rods ending in arrows, their brass pegs, and the great balls of the fire dogs shone suddenly when the sun came in. On the chimney between the candelabra there were 2 of those pink shells in which one hears the murmur of the sea if one holds them to the ear. How they loved that dear room, so full of gaiety, despite its rather faded splendor. They always found the furniture in the same place, and sometimes hairpins that she had forgotten the Thursday before, under the pedestal of the clock. They lunched by the fireside on a little round table, inlaid with rosewood. Emma carved, put bits on his plate, with all sorts of coquettish ways, and she laughed with a sonorous and libertine laugh when the froth of the champagne ran over from the glass to the rings on her fingers. They were so completely lost in the possession of each other that they thought themselves in their own house, and that they would live there till death, like 2 spouses, eternally young. They said our room, our carpet. She even said my slippers, a gift of Leon's, a whim she had had. They were pink satin, bordered with swan's down. When she sat on his knees, her leg, then too short, hung in the air, and the dainty shoe, that had no back to it, was held only by the toes to her barefoot. He for the first time enjoyed the inexpressible delicacy of feminine refinements. He had never met this grace of language, this reserve of clothing, these poses of the weary dove. He admired the exaltation of her soul and the lace on her petticoat. Besides, was she not a lady and a married woman, a real mistress, in fine? By the diversity of her humor, in turn mystical or mirthful, talkative, taciturn, passionate, careless, she awakened in him 1,000 desires, called up instincts or memories. She was the mistress of all the novels, the heroine of all the dramas, the vague she of all the volumes of verse. He found again on her shoulder the amber coloring of the odalisque bathing. She had the long waist of feudal chatelaines, and she resembled the pale woman of Barcelona. But above all she was the angel. Often looking at her, it seemed to him that his soul, escaping towards her, spread like a wave about the outline of her head, and descended, drawn down into the whiteness of her breast. He knelt on the ground before her, and with both elbows on her knees looked at her with a smile, his face upturned. She bent over him and murmured, as if choking with intoxication, "Oh, do not move. Do not speak. Look at me. Something so sweet comes from your eyes that helps me so much." She called him, "Child. Child, do you love me?" And she did not listen for his answer in the haste of her lips that fastened to his mouth. On the clock there was a bronze Cupid, who smirked as he bent his arm beneath a golden garland. They had laughed at it many a time, but when they had to part everything seemed serious to them. Motionless in front of each other, they kept repeating, "Till Thursday, till Thursday." Suddenly she seized his head between her hands, kissed him hurriedly on the forehead, crying, "Adieu," and rushed down the stairs. She went to a hairdresser's in the Rue de la Comédie to have her hair arranged. Night fell, the gas was lighted in the shop. She heard the bell at the theater calling the mummers to the performance, and she saw, passing opposite, men with white faces and women in faded gowns going in at the stage door. It was hot in the room, small and too low where the stove was hissing. In the midst of wigs and pomades, the smell of the trunks, together with the greasy hands that handled her head, soon stunned her, and she dozed a little in her wrapper. Often, as he did her hair, the man offered her tickets for a masked ball. Then she went away. She went up the streets, reached the Croix Rouge, put on her overshoes that she had hidden in the morning under the seat, and sank into her place among the impatient passengers. Some got out at the foot of the hill. She remained alone in the carriage. At every turning all the lights of the town were seen more and more completely, making a great luminous vapor about the dim houses. Emma knelt on the cushions and her eyes wandered over the dazzling light. She sobbed, called on Leon, sent him tender words and kisses lost in the wind. On the hillside a poor devil wandered about with his stick in the midst of the diligences. A mass of rags covered his shoulders, and an old Staveden beaver, turned out like a basin, hid his face, but when he took it off he discovered in the place of eyelids empty and bloody orbits. The flesh hung in red shreds, and there flowed from it liquids that congealed into green scale down to the nose, whose black nostrils sniffed convulsively. To speak to you he threw back his head with an idiotic laugh, then his bluish eyeballs, rolling constantly at the temples, beat against the edge of the open wound. He sang a little song as he followed the carriage's dash. Maids and the warmth of a summer day dream of love, and of love always. And all the rest was about birds and sunshine and green leaves. Sometimes he appeared suddenly behind Emma, bareheaded, and she drew back with a cry. Hibbert made fun of him. He would advise him to get a booth at the Saint Romain Fair, or else ask him, laughing, how his young woman was. Often they had started when, with a sudden movement, his hat entered the diligence through the small window, while he clung with his other arm to the footboard, between the wheels splashing mud. His voice, feeble at first and quavering, grew sharp. It resounded in the night like the indistinct moan of a vague distress, and through the ringing of the bells, the murmur of the trees, and the rumbling of the empty vehicle, it had a far-off sound that disturbed Emma. It went to the bottom of her soul, like a whirlwind in an abyss, and carried her away into the distances of a boundless melancholy. But Hibbert, noticing a weight behind, gave the blind man sharp cuts with his whip. The thong lashed his wounds, and he fell back into the mud with a yell. Then the passengers in the Hirondelle ended by falling asleep, some with open mouths, others with lowered shins, leaning against their neighbor's shoulder, or with their arm passed through the strap, oscillating regularly with the jolting of the carriage, and the reflection of the lantern swinging without on the crupper of the wheeler, penetrating into the interior through the chocolate calico curtains, through sanguineous shadows over all these motionless people. Emma, drunk with grief, shivered in her clothes, feeling her feet grow colder and death in her soul. Charles at home was waiting for her. The Hirondelle was always late. On Thursdays, Madame arrived at last, and scarcely kissed the child. The dinner was not ready. No matter. She excused the servant. This girl now seemed allowed to do just as she liked. Often her husband, noting her pallor, asked if she were unwell. "No," said Emma. "But," he replied, "you seem so strange this evening." "Oh, it's nothing. Nothing." There were even days when she had no sooner come in than she went up to her room, and Justin, happening to be there, moved about noiselessly, quicker at helping her than the best of maids. He put the matches ready, the candlestick, a book, arranged her nightgown, turned back the bedclothes. "Come," said she, "that will do. Now you can go." For he stood there, his hands hanging down and his eyes wide open, as if enmeshed in the innumerable threads of a sudden reverie. The following day was frightful, and those that came after still more unbearable, because of her impatience to once again seize her happiness, an ardent lust inflamed by the images of past experience, and that burst forth freely on the seventh day beneath Leon's caresses. His ardors were hidden beneath outbursts of wonder and gratitude. Emma tasted this love in a discreet, absorbed fashion, maintained it by all the artifices of her tenderness, and trembled a little lest it should be lost later on. She often said to him, with her sweet, melancholy voice, "You will leave me. You will marry. You will be like all the others." He asked, "What others?" "Why, like all men," she replied. Then added, repulsing him with a languid movement, "You are all evil." One day, as they were talking philosophically of earthly disillusions, to experiment on his jealousy, or yielding, perhaps, to an overstrong need to pour out her heart, she told him that formerly, before him, she had loved someone. "Not like you," she went on quickly, protesting by the head of her child that nothing had passed between them. The young man believed her, but none the less questioned her to find out what he was. "He was a ship's captain, my dear." Was this not preventing any inquiry, and at the same time assuming a higher ground through this pretended fascination exercised over a man who must have been of warlike nature and accustomed to receive homage? The clerk then felt the lowliness of his position. He longed for epaulets, crosses, titles, all that would please her. He gathered that from her spendthrift habits. Emma nevertheless concealed many of these extravagant fancies, such as her wish to have a blue tilbury to drive into Rouen, drawn by an English horse and driven by a groom in top boots. It was Justin who had inspired her with this whim, by begging her to take him into her services, valet de chambre *, and if the privation of it did not lessen the pleasure of her arrival at each rendezvous, it certainly augmented the bitterness of the return. Manservant. Often, when they talked together of Paris, she ended by murmuring, "How happy we should be there." "Are we not happy?" gently answered the young man, passing his hands over her hair. "Yes, that is true," she said. "I am mad. Kiss me." To her husband she was more charming than ever. She made him pistachio creams, and played him waltzes after dinner. So he thought himself the most fortunate of men, and Emma was without uneasiness, when one evening suddenly he said, "It is Mademoiselle Emperor, isn't it, who gives you lessons?" "Yes." "Well, I saw her just now," Charles went on, "at Madame Lagarde's. I spoke to her about you, and she doesn't know you." This was like a thunderclap. "However," she replied quite naturally, No doubt she forgot my name. But perhaps, said the doctor, there are several demoiselles l'Empereur and Rouen who are music mistresses. Possibly. Then quickly but I have my receipts here. See. And she went to the writing table, ransacked all the drawers, rummaged the papers, and at last lost her head so completely that Charles earnestly begged her not to take so much trouble about those wretched receipts. Oh, I will find them, she said. And, in fact, on the following Friday, as Charles was putting on one of his boots in the dark cabinet where his clothes were kept, he felt a piece of paper between the leather and his sock. He took it out and read received, for 3 months' lessons and several pieces of music, the sum of 63 francs. Félicie l'Empereur, professor of music. How the devil did it get into my boots? It must, she replied, have fallen from the old box of bills that is on the edge of the shelf. From that moment her existence was but one long tissue of lies, in which she enveloped her love as in veils to hide it. It was a want, a mania, a pleasure carried to such an extent that if she said she had the day before walked on the right side of a road, one might know she had taken the left. One morning, when she had gone, as usual, rather lightly clothed, it suddenly began to snow, and as Charles was watching the weather from the window, he caught sight of Monsieur Bournisien in the chaise of Monsieur Tuvache, who was driving him to Rouen. Then he went down to give the priest a thick shawl that he was to hand over to Emma as soon as he reached the Croix Rouge. When he got to the inn, Monsieur Bournisien asked for the wife of the Yonville doctor. The landlady replied that she very rarely came to her establishment. So that evening, when he recognized Madame Bovary in the Hirondelle, the cure told her his dilemma, without, however, appearing to attach much importance to it, for he began praising the preacher who was doing wonders at the cathedral, and whom all the ladies were rushing to hear. Still, if he did not ask for any explanation, others, later on, might prove less discreet. So she thought well to get down each time at the Croix Rouge so that the good folk of her village who saw her on the stairs should suspect nothing. One day, however, Monsieur Leroux met her coming out of the Hotel de Boulogne on Lyon's arm, and she was frightened, thinking he would gossip. He was not such a fool. But 3 days after he came to her room, shut the door, and said, I must have some money. She declared she could not give him any. Leroux burst into lamentations and reminded her of all the kindnesses he had shown her. In fact, of the 2 bills signed by Charles, Emma up to the present had paid only one. As to the second, the shopkeeper, at her request, had consented to replace it by another, which again had been renewed for a long date. Then he drew from his pocket a list of goods not paid for, too. But the curtains, the carpet, the material for the armchairs, several dresses, and divers articles of dress, the bills for which amounted to about 2,000 francs. She bowed her head. He went on but if you haven't any ready money, you have an estate. And he reminded her of a miserable little hovel situated at Barneville, near Aumale, that brought in almost nothing. It had formerly been part of a small farm sold by Monsieur Bovary Sr., for Leroux knew everything, even to the number of acres and the names of the neighbors. If I were in your place, he said, I should clear myself of my debts and have money left over. She pointed out the difficulty of getting a purchaser. He held out the hope of finding one, but she asked him how she should manage to sell it. Haven't you your power of attorney? He replied. The phrase came to her like a breath of fresh air. Leave me the bill, said Emma. Oh, it isn't worthwhile, answered Leroux. He came back the following week and boasted of having, after much trouble, at last discovered a certain Longhua who, for a long time, had an eye on the property, but without mentioning his price. "Never mind the price," she cried. But they would, on the contrary, have to wait to sound the fellow. The thing was worth a journey, and as she could not undertake it, he offered to go to the place to have an interview with Longhua. On his return he announced that the purchaser proposed 4,000 francs. Emma was radiant at this news. "Frankly," he added, "that's a good price." She drew half the sum at once, and when she was about to pay her account, the shopkeeper said, "It really grieves me, on my word, to see you depriving yourself all at once of such a big sum as that." Then she looked at the banknotes, and dreaming of the unlimited number of rendezvous represented by those 2,000 francs, she stammered, "What? Oh," he went on, laughing good-naturedly, "one puts anything one likes on receipts. Don't you think I know what household affairs are?" And he looked at her fixedly, while in his hand he held 2 long papers that he slid between his nails. At last, opening his pocket-book, he spread out on the table 4 bills to order, each for 1,000 francs. "Sign these," he said, "and keep it all." She cried out, scandalized. "But if I give you the surplus," replied Monsieur Leroux impudently, "is that not helping you?" And taking a pen he wrote at the bottom of the account, "Received of Madame Bovary 4,000 francs. Now who can trouble you, since in 6 months you'll draw the arrears for your cottage, and I don't make the last bill due till after you've been paid." Emma grew rather confused in her calculations, and her ears tingled, as if gold pieces, bursting from their bags, rang all round her on the floor. At last Leroux explained that he had a very good friend, Vincart, a broker at Rouen, who would discount these 4 bills. Then he himself would hand over to Madame the remainder after the actual debt was paid. But instead of 2,000 francs he brought only 1,800, for the friend Vincart, which was only fair, had deducted 200 francs for commission and discount. Then he carelessly asked for a receipt. "You understand in business sometimes. And with the date, if you please, with the date." A horizon of realizable whims opened out before Emma. She was prudent enough to lay by 1,000 crowns, with which the first 3 bills were paid when they fell due, but the 4th, by chance, came to the house on a Thursday, and Charles, quite upset, patiently awaited his wife's return for an explanation. If she had not told him about this bill, it was only to spare him such domestic worries. She sat on his knees, caressed him, cooed to him, gave him a long enumeration of all the indispensable things that had been got on credit. "Really, you must confess, considering the quantity, it isn't too dear." Charles, at his wit's end, soon had recourse to the eternal Leroux, who swore he would arrange matters if the doctor would sign him 2 bills, one of which was for 700 francs, payable in 3 months. In order to arrange for this he wrote his mother a pathetic letter. Instead of sending a reply she came herself, and when Emma wanted to know whether he had got anything out of her, "Yes," he replied, "but she wants to see the account." The next morning at daybreak Emma ran to Leroux to beg him to make out another account for not more than 1,000 francs, for to show the one for 4,000. It would be necessary to say that she had paid 2/3, and confess, consequently, the sale of the estate, a negotiation admirably carried out by the shopkeeper, and which, in fact, was only actually known later on. Despite the low price of each article, Madame Bovary Sr., of course, thought the expenditure extravagant. "Couldn't you do without a carpet? Why have recovered the armchairs? In my time there was a single armchair in the house, for elderly persons at Any rate it was so at my mother's, who was a good woman, I can tell you. Everybody can't be rich. No fortune can hold out against waste. I should be ashamed to coddle myself as you do. And yet I am old. I need looking after. And there, fitting up gowns. Fallows. What? Silk for lining at 2 francs when you can get Jacques knit for 10 sous or even for 8. That would do well enough. Emma, lying on a lounge, replied as quietly as possible, Madam, enough. Enough. The other went on lecturing her, predicting they would end in the workhouse. But it was Bovary's fault. Luckily he had promised to destroy that power of attorney. What? He swore he would, went on the good woman. Emma opened the window, called Charles, and the poor fellow was obliged to confess the promise torn from him by his mother. Emma disappeared, then came back quickly and majestically handed her a thick piece of paper. "Thank you," said the old woman. And she threw the power of attorney into the fire. Emma began to laugh, a strident, piercing, continuous laugh. She had an attack of hysterics. "Oh my God!" cried Charles. You really are wrong. You come here and make scenes with her." His mother, shrugging her shoulders, declared it was all put on. But Charles, rebelling for the first time, took his wife's part, so that Madame Bovary, Senior, said she would leave. She went the very next day, and on the threshold, as he was trying to detain her, she replied, "No, no. You love her better than me, and you are right. It is natural. For the rest, so much the worse. You will see. Good day, for I am not likely to come soon again, as you say, to make scenes." Charles nevertheless was very crestfallen before Emma, who did not hide the resentment she still felt at his want of confidence, and it needed many prayers before she would consent to have another power of attorney. He even accompanied her to Monsieur Guillaumin to have a second one, just like the other, drawn up. "I understand," said the notary. "A man of science can't be worried with the practical details of life." And Charles felt relieved by this comfortable reflection, which gave his weakness the flattering appearance of higher preoccupation. And what an outburst the next Thursday at the hotel in their room with Leon! She laughed, cried, sang, sent for sherbets, wanted to smoke. Cigarettes seemed to him wild and extravagant, but adorable, superb. He did not know what the creation of her whole being drove her more and more to plunge into the pleasures of life. She was becoming irritable, greedy, voluptuous, and she walked about the streets with him, carrying her head high, without fear, so she said, of compromising herself. At times, however, Emma shuddered at the sudden thought of meeting Rodolphe, for it seemed to her that, although they were separated forever, she was not completely free from her subjugation to him. One night she did not return to Yonville at all. Charles lost his head with anxiety, and little Berthe would not go to bed without her mamma, and sobbed enough to break her heart. Justine had gone out searching the road at random. Monsieur Hamai even had left his pharmacy. At last, at 11 o'clock, able to bear it no longer, Charles harnessed his chaise, jumped in, whipped up his horse, and reached the Croix Rouge about 2 o'clock in the morning. No one there. He thought that the clerk had perhaps seen her, but where did he live? Happily, Charles remembered his employer's address and rushed off there. Day was breaking, and he could distinguish the escutcheons over the door, and knocked. Someone, without opening the door, shouted out the required information, adding a few insults to those who disturb people in the middle of the night. The house inhabited by the clerk had neither bell, knocker, nor porter. Charles knocked loudly at the shutters with his hands. A policeman happened to pass by. Then he was frightened, and went away. "I am mad," he said. "No doubt they kept her to dinner at Monsieur Lormeaux." But the Lormeaux no longer lived at Rouen. She probably stayed to look after Madame Dubreuil. Why, Madame Dubreuil has been dead these 10 months. Where can she be? An idea occurred to him. At a cafe he asked for a directory and hurriedly looked for the name of Mademoiselle Emperor, who lived at No. 74 Rue de la Renaud des Maroquiniers. As he was turning into the street, Emma herself appeared at the other end of it. He threw himself upon her rather than embraced her, crying, "What kept you yesterday?" "I was not well." "What was it? Where? How?" She passed her hand over her forehead and answered, "At Mademoiselle Lemperre's." "I was sure of it. I was going there." "Oh, it isn't worthwhile," said Emma. "She went out just now, but for the future don't worry. I do not feel free, you see, if I know that the least delay upsets you like this." This was a sort of permission that she gave herself, so as to get perfect freedom in her escapades. And she profited by it freely, fully. When she was seized with the desire to see Leon, she set out upon any pretext, and as he was not expecting her on that day, she went to fetch him at his office. It was a great delight at first, but soon he no longer concealed the truth, which was, that his master complained very much about these interruptions. "Shaw, come along," she said. And he slipped out. She wanted him to dress all in black, and grow a pointed beard, to look like the portraits of Louis XIII. She wanted to see his lodgings, thought them poor. He blushed at them, but she did not notice this, then advised him to buy some curtains like hers, and as he objected to the expense, "You care for your money," she said, laughing. Each time Leon had to tell her everything that he had done since their last meeting. She asked him for some verses for herself, a love poem, in honor of her. But he never succeeded in getting a rhyme for the second verse, and at last ended by copying a sonnet in a keepsake. This was less from vanity than from the one desire of pleasing her. He did not question her ideas, he accepted all her tastes, he was rather becoming her mistress than she his. She had tender words and kisses that thrilled his soul. Where could she have learned this? Corruption almost incorporeal in the strength of its profanity and dissimulation. Chapter 6. During the journeys he made to see her, Leon had often dined at the chemist's, and he felt obliged from politeness to invite him in turn. "With pleasure," Monsieur Hamai replied. "Besides, I must invigorate my mind, for I am getting rusty here. We'll go to the theater, to the restaurant, we'll make a night of it." "Oh, my dear," tenderly murmured Madame Hamai, alarmed at the vague perils he was preparing to brave. "Well, what? Do you think I'm not sufficiently ruining my health living here amid the continual emanations of the pharmacy? But there, that is the way with women. They are jealous of science, and then are opposed to our taking the most legitimate distractions. No matter. Count upon me. One of these days I shall turn up at Rouen, and we'll go the pace together." The druggist would formerly have taken good care not to use such an expression, but he was cultivating a gay Parisian style which he thought in the best taste, and, like his neighbor, Madame Bovary, he questioned the clerk curiously about the customs of the capital. He even joked slang to dazzle the bourgeois, saying "Bender, crummy, dandy, macaroni, the cheese, cut my stick and I'll hook it, for I am going." So one Thursday Emma was surprised to meet Monsieur Hamai in the kitchen of the Lion d'Or, wearing a traveler's costume, that is true. Say, wrapped in an old cloak which no one knew he had, while he carried a valise in one hand and the foot warmer of his establishment in the other. He had confided his intentions to no one, for fear of causing the public anxiety by his absence. The idea of seeing again the place where his youth had been spent no doubt excited him, for during the whole journey he never ceased trucking, and as soon as he had arrived, he jumped quickly out of the diligence to go in search of Leon. In vain the clerk tried to get rid of him. Monsieur Hamad dragged him off to the large Café de la Normandie, which he entered majestically, not raising his hat, thinking it very provincial to uncover in any public place. Emma waited for Leon 3/4 of an hour. At last she ran to his office, and, lost in all sorts of conjectures, accusing him of indifference, and reproaching herself for her weakness, she spent the afternoon, her face pressed against the window panes. At 2 o'clock they were still at a table opposite each other. The large room was emptying, the stovepipe, in the shape of a palm tree, spread its gilt leaves over the white ceiling, and near them, outside the window in the bright sunshine, a little fountain gurgled in a white basin, where, in the midst of watercress and asparagus, 3 torpid lobsters stretched across to some quails that lay heaped up in a pile on their sides. Himai was enjoying himself, although he was even more intoxicated with the luxury than the rich fare. The Pomard wine all the same rather excited his faculties, and when the Amuletum asterisk appeared, he began propounding immoral theories about women. What seduced him above all else was chic. He admired an elegant toilette in a well-furnished apartment, and as to bodily qualities, he didn't dislike a young girl. Asterisk in rum. Leon watched the clock in despair. The druggist went on drinking, eating, and talking. "You must be very lonely," he said suddenly. "Here at Rouen. To be sure. Your lady love doesn't live far away." And the other blushed. "Come now, be frank. Can you deny that at Yonville The young man stammered something. "At Madame Bovary's you are not making love to To whom?" "The servant." He was not joking, but vanity getting the better of all prudence, Leon, in spite of himself, protested. Besides, he only liked dark women. "I approve of that," said the chemist. "They have more passion." And whispering into his friend's ear, he pointed out the symptoms by which one could find out if a woman had passion. He even launched into an ethnographic digression. The German was vaporish, the French woman licentious, the Italian passionate. "And negresses?" asked the clerk. "They are an artistic taste," said Hamai. "Waiter, 2 cups of coffee." "Are we going?" at last asked Leon impatiently. "Ja." But before leaving he wanted to see the proprietor of the establishment, and made him a few compliments. Then the young man, to be alone, alleged he had some business engagement. I will escort you," said Hamai. And all the while he was walking through the streets with him he talked of his wife, his children, of their future, and of his business, told him in what a decayed condition it had formerly been, and to what a degree of perfection he had raised it. Arrived in front of the Hotel de Boulogne, Leon left him abruptly, ran up the stairs, and found his mistress in great excitement. At mention of the chemist she flew into a passion. He, however, piled up good reasons. It wasn't his fault. Didn't she know him? Did she believe that he would prefer his company? But she turned away. He drew her back, and, sinking on his knees, clasped her waist with his arms in a languorous pose full of concupiscence and supplication. She was standing up. Her large flashing eyes looked at him seriously, almost terribly. Then tears obscured them. Her red eyelids were lowered. She gave him her hands, and Leon was pressing them to his lips when a servant appeared to tell the gentleman that he was wanted. "You will come back," she said. "Yes." "But when?" "Immediately." "It's a trick," said the chemist, when he saw Leon. "I wanted to interrupt this visit that seemed to me to annoy you. Let's go and have a glass of Garris and Prideaux." Leon vowed that he must get back to his office. Then the druggist joked him about quill drivers and the law. "Leave Cudges and Barthel alone a bit. Who the devil prevents you? Yeah, man. Let's go to Prideaux. You'll see his dog. It's very interesting." And as the clerk still insisted, "I'll go with you. I'll read a paper while I wait for you, or turn over the leaves of a code." Leon, bewildered by Emma's anger, Monsieur Homais' chatter, and, perhaps, by the heaviness of the luncheon, was undecided and, as it were, fascinated by the chemist, who kept repeating, "Let's go to Prideaux. It's just by here, in the Rue Malpalu." Then, through cowardice, through stupidity, through that indefinable feeling that drags us into the most distasteful acts, he allowed himself to be led off to Prideaux, whom they found in his small yard, superintending 3 workmen, who panted as they turned the large wheel of a machine for making seltzer water. Himai gave them some good advice. He embraced Prideaux. They took some Garris. 20 times Leon tried to escape, but the other seized him by the arm, saying, "Presently. I'm coming. We'll go to the Finale Rouen to see the fellows there. I'll introduce you to Thornasson." At last he managed to get rid of him and rushed straight to the hotel. Emma was no longer there. She had just gone in a fit of anger. She detested him now. This failing to keep their rendezvous seemed to her an insult, and she tried to rake up other reasons to separate herself from him. He was incapable of heroism, weak, banal, more spiritless than a woman, avaricious too, and cowardly. Then, growing calmer, she at length discovered that she had, no doubt, calumniated him. But the disparaging of those we love always alienates us from them to some extent. We must not judge our idols. The guilt sticks to our fingers. They gradually came to talking more frequently of matters outside their love, and in the letters that Emma wrote him she spoke of flowers, verses, the moon and the stars, naive resources of a waning passion, striving to keep itself alive by all external aids. She was constantly promising herself a profound felicity on her next journey. Then she confessed to herself that she felt nothing extraordinary. This disappointment quickly gave way to a new hope, and Emma returned to him, more inflamed, more eager than ever. She undressed brutally, tearing off the thin laces of her corset that nestled around her hips like a gliding snake. She went on tiptoe, barefooted, to see once more that the door was closed. Then, pale, serious, and, without speaking, with one movement she threw herself upon his breast with a long shudder. Yet there was upon that brow covered with cold drops, on those quivering lips, in those wild eyes, in the strain of those arms, something vague and dreary that seemed to Leon to glide between them subtly as if to separate them. He did not dare to question her, but, seeing her so skilled, she must have passed, he thought, through every experience of suffering and of pleasure. What had once charmed now frightened him a little. Besides, he rebelled against his absorption, daily more marked by her personality. He begrudged Emma this constant victory. He even strove not to love her. Then, when he heard the creaking of her boots, he turned coward, like drunkards at the sight of strong drinks. She did not fail, in truth, to lavish all sorts of attentions upon him, from the delicacies of food to the coquetries of dress and languishing looks. She brought roses to her breast from Yonville, which she threw into his face, was anxious about his health, gave him advice as to his conduct, and, in order the more surely to keep her hold on him, hoping perhaps that heaven would take her part. She tied a medal of the Virgin round his neck. She inquired like a virtuous mother about his companions. She said to him, "Don't see them, don't go out, think only of ourselves, love me." She would have liked to be able to watch over his life, and the idea occurred to her of having him followed in the streets. Near the hotel, there was always a kind of loafer who accosted travelers, and who would not refuse. But her pride revolted at this. "Bah! So much the worse. Let him deceive me. What does it matter to me? As if I cared for him." One day, when they had parted early and she was returning alone along the boulevard, she saw the walls of her convent. Then she sat down on a form in the shade of the elm trees. How calm that time had been! How she longed for the ineffable sentiments of love that she had tried to figure to herself out of books. The first month of her marriage, her rides in the wood, the Viscount that waltzed and Lagardy singing, all were passed before her eyes, and Leon suddenly appeared to her as far off as the others. "Yet I love him," she said to herself. No matter. She was not happy, she never had been. Whence came this insufficiency in life, this instantaneous turning to decay of everything on which she leant? But if there were somewhere a being strong and beautiful, a valiant nature, full at once of exultation and refinement, a poet's heart in an angel's form, a lyre with sounding chords ringing out elegiac epithalamium to heaven, why, perchance, should she not find him? How impossible! Besides, nothing was worth the trouble of seeking it. Everything was a lie. Every smile hid a yawn of boredom, every joy a curse, all pleasure satiety, and the sweetest kisses left upon your lips only the unattainable desire for a greater delight. A metallic clang droned through the air, and 4 strokes were heard from the convent clock. 4 o'clock. And it seemed to her that she had been there on that form in eternity. But an infinity of passions may be contained in a minute, like a crowd in a small space. Emma lived all absorbed in hers, and troubled no more about money matters than an archduchess. Once, however, a wretched-looking man, Earl Viscount Bald, came to her house saying he had been sent by Monsieur Vincart de Rouen. He took out the pins that held together the side pockets of his long green overcoat, stuck them into his sleeve, and politely handed her a paper. It was a bill for 700 francs signed by her, and which Leroux, in spite of all his professions, had paid away to Vincart. She sent her servant for him. He could not come. Then the stranger, who had remained standing, casting right and left curious glances that his thick, fair eyebrows hid, asked with a naive air, "What answer am I to take, Monsieur Vincart?" "Oh," said Emma, "tell him that I haven't it. I will send next week. He must wait, yes, till next week." And the fellow went without another word. But the next day at 12 o'clock she received a summons, and the sight of the stamped paper, on which appeared several times in large letters, "Maitre Harangue, bailiff at Buchy," so frightened her that she rushed in hot haste to the linen draper's. She found him in his shop, doing up a parcel. "Your obedient," he said. "I am at your service." But Leroux, all the same, went on with his work, helped by a young girl of about 13, somewhat hunchbacked, who was at once his clerk and his servant. Then, his clogs clattering on the shop boards, he went up in front of Madame Bovary to the first door and introduced her into a narrow closet where, in a large bureau in sapinwood, lay some ledgers, protected by a horizontal padlocked iron bar against the wall. Under some remnants of calico, one glimpsed a safe, but of such dimensions that it must contain something besides bills and money. Monsieur Leroux, in fact, went in for pawnbroking, and it was there that he had put Madame Bovary's gold chain, together with the earrings of poor old Tellier, who, at last forced to sell out, had bought a meagre store of grocery at Quincampoix, where he was dying of catarrh amongst his candles, that were less yellow than his face. Leroux sat down in a large cane armchair, saying, "What news?" "See." And she showed him a paper. "Well, how can I help it?" Then she grew angry, reminding him of the promise he had given not to pay away her bills. He acknowledged it. "But I was pressed myself, the knife was at my own throat." "And what will happen now?" she went on. "Oh, it's very simple, a judgment and then a distraint, that's about it." Emma kept down a desire to strike him, and asked gently if there was no way of quieting Monsieur Vincart. "I dare say." "Quiet Vincart? You don't know him, he's more ferocious than an Arab." Still Monsieur Leroux must interfere. "Well, listen. It seems to me so far I've been very good to you." And, opening one of his ledgers, "See," he said. Then running up the page with his finger, Let's see. August 3rd, 200 francs. June 17th, 150. March 23rd, 46. In April dash. He stopped, as if afraid of making some mistake. Not to speak of the bills signed by Monsieur Bovary, one for 700 francs and another for 300. As to your little installments, with the interest, why there's no end to 'em, one gets quite muddled over 'em. I'll have nothing more to do with it." She wept. She even called him her good Monsieur Leroux. But he always fell back upon that rascal Vincart. Besides, he hadn't a brass farthing, no one was paying him nowadays, they were eating his coat off his back, a poor shopkeeper like him couldn't advance money. Emma was silent, and Monsieur Leroux, who was biting the feathers of a quill, no doubt became uneasy at her silence, for he went on dash. "Unless one of these days I have something coming in, I might dash. Besides," said she, as soon as the balance of Barneville dash. "What?" And on hearing that Langlois had not yet paid, he seemed much surprised. Then in a honeyed voice dash. "And we agree, you say?" "Oh, to anything you like." On this he closed his eyes to reflect, wrote down a few figures, and, declaring it would be very difficult for him, that the affair was shady, and that he was being bled, he wrote out 4 bills for 250 francs each, to fall due month by month. "Provided that Vincart will listen to me. However, it's settled. I don't play the fool, I'm straight enough." Next he carelessly showed her several new goods, not one of which, however, was in his opinion worthy of Madame. "When I think that there's a dress at 3 halfpenny a yard, and warranted fast colors, and yet they actually swallow it. Of course you understand one doesn't tell them what it really is." He hoped by this confession of dishonesty to others to quite convince her of his probity to her. Then he called her back to show her 3 yards of guipure that he had lately picked up at a sale. "Isn't it lovely?" said Leroux. "It is very much used now for the backs of armchairs. It's quite the rage." And, more ready than a juggler, he wrapped up the guipure in some blue paper and put it in Emma's hands. "But at least let me know dash." "Yes, another time," he replied, turning on his heel. That same evening she urged Bovary to write to his mother, to ask her to send as quickly as possible the whole of the balance due from the father's estate. The mother-in-law replied that she had nothing more. The winding up was over, and there was due to them besides Barneville an income of 600 francs, that she would pay them punctually. Then Madame Bovary sent in accounts to 2 or 3 patients, and she made large use of this method, which was very successful. She was always careful to add a postscript, Do not mention this to my husband. You know how proud he is. Excuse me. Yours obediently. There were some complaints. She intercepted them. To get money she began selling her old gloves, her old hats, the old odds and ends, and she bargained rapaciously, her peasant blood standing her in good stead. Then on her journey to town she picked up knickknacks, second-hand, that in default of anyone else, Miss Earle would certainly take off her hands. She bought ostrich feathers, Chinese porcelain, and trunks she borrowed from Félicite, from Madame Lefrancois, from the landlady at the Croix Rouge, from everybody, no matter where. With the money she at last received from Barneville she paid 2 bills, the other 1,500 francs fell due. She renewed the bills, and thus it was continually. Sometimes, it is true, she tried to make a calculation, but she discovered things so exorbitant that she could not believe them possible. Then she recommenced, soon got confused, gave it all up, and thought no more about it. The house was very dreary now. Tradesmen were seen leaving it with angry faces. Handkerchiefs were lying about on the stoves, and little Berthe, to the great scandal of Madame Hamai, wore stockings with holes in them. If Charles timidly ventured a remark, she answered roughly that it wasn't her fault. What was the meaning of all these fits of temper? He explained everything through her old nervous illness, and reproaching himself with having taken her infirmities for faults, accused himself of egotism, and longed to go and take her in his arms. No, he said to himself, I should worry her. And he did not stir. After dinner he walked about alone in the garden. He took little Berthe on his knees, and unfolding his medical journal, tried to teach her to read. But the child, who never had any lessons, soon looked up with large, sad eyes and began to cry. Then he comforted her, went to fetch water in her can to make rivers on the sand path, or broke off branches from the privet hedges to plant trees in the beds. This did not spoil the garden much, all choked now with long weeds. They owed Lestiboudoy for so many days. Then the child grew cold and asked for her mother. Call the servant, said Charles. You know, dearie, that Mamma does not like to be disturbed. Autumn was setting in, and the leaves were already falling, as they did 2 years ago when she was in Illinois where wooded Holland. And he walked up and down, his hands behind his back. Madame was in her room, which no one entered. She stayed there all day long, torpid, half-dressed, and from time to time burning Turkish pastels which she had bought at Rouen in an Algerian's shop, in order not to have at night this sleeping man stretched at her side. By dint of maneuvering, she at last succeeded in banishing him to the second floor, while she read till morning extravagant books full of pictures of orgies and thrilling situations. Often, seized with fear, she cried out and Charles hurried to her. Oh, go away, she would say. Or at other times, consumed more ardently than ever by that inner flame, to which adultery added fuel, panting tremulous, all desire, she threw open her window, breathed in the cold air, shook loose in the wind her masses of hair, too heavy, and, gazing upon the stars, longed for some princely love. She thought of him, of Leon. She would then have given anything for a single one of those meetings that surfeited her. These were her gala days. She wanted them to be sumptuous, and when he alone could not pay the expenses, she made up the deficit liberally, which happened pretty well every time. He tried to make her understand that they would be quite as comfortable somewhere else in a smaller hotel, but she always found some objection. One day she drew 6 small silver gilt spoons from her bag. They were old Rouault's wedding present, begging him to bond them at once for her, and Leon obeyed, though the proceeding annoyed him. He was afraid of compromising himself. Then, on reflection, he began to think his mistress's ways were growing odd, and that they were perhaps not wrong in wishing to separate him from her. In fact, someone had sent his mother a long anonymous letter to warn her that he was ruining himself with a married woman, and the good lady at once conjuring up the eternal bugbear of families, the vague pernicious creature, the siren, the monster who dwells fantastically in depths of love, wrote to Lawyer Dubocage, his employer, who behaved perfectly in the affair. He kept him for 3/4 of an hour trying to open his eyes to warn him of the abyss into which he was falling. Such an intrigue would damage him later on, when he set up for himself. He implored him to break with her, and if he would not make this sacrifice in his own interest, to do it at least for his, Dubocage's sake. At last Leon swore he would not see Emma again, and he reproached himself with not having kept his word, considering all the worry and lectures this woman might still draw down upon him, without reckoning the jokes made by his companions as they sat round the stove in the morning. Besides, he was soon to be head clerk, it was time to settle down. So he gave up his flute, exalted sentiments, and poetry, for every bourgeois in the flush of his youth, were it but for a day, a moment, has believed himself capable of immense passions, of lofty enterprises. The most mediocre libertine has dreamed of sultanas, every notary bears within him the debris of a poet. He was bored now when Emma suddenly began to sob on his breast, and his heart, like the people who can only stand a certain amount of music, dozed to the sound of a love whose delicacies he no longer noted. They knew one another too well for any of those surprises of possession that increase its joys 100-fold. She was as sick of him as he was weary of her. Emma found again in adultery all the platitudes of marriage. But how to get rid of him? Then, though she might feel humiliated at the baseness of such enjoyment, she clung to it from habit or from corruption, and each day she hungered after them the more, exhausting all felicity in wishing for too much of it. She accused Leon of her baffled hopes, as if he had betrayed her, and she even longed for some catastrophe that would bring about their separation, since she had not the courage to make up her mind to it herself. She nonetheless went on writing him love letters, in virtue of the notion that a woman must write to her lover. But whilst she wrote, it was another man she saw, a phantom fashioned out of her most ardent memories, of her finest reading, her strongest lusts, and at last he became so real, so tangible, that she palpitated, wondering, without, however, the power to imagine him clearly, so lost was he, like a god, beneath the abundance of his attributes. He dwelt in that azure land where silk ladders hang from balconies under the breath of flowers, in the light of the moon. She felt him near her, he was coming, and would carry her right away in a kiss. Then she fell back exhausted, for these transports of vague love wearied her more than great debauchery. She now felt constant ache all over her. Often she even received summonses, stamped paper that she barely looked at. She would have liked not to be alive or to be always asleep. On Midland she did not return to Yonville, but in the evening went to a masked ball. She wore velvet breeches, red stockings, a club wig, and three-cornered hat cocked on one side. She danced all night to the wild tones of the trombones. People gathered round her, and in the morning she found herself on the steps of the theater together with 5 or 6 masks, tabardoises and sailors, Leon's comrades, who were talking about having supper. People dressed as longshoremen. The neighboring cafes were full. They got sight of one on the harbor, a very indifferent restaurant, whose proprietor showed them to a little room on the 4th floor. The men were whispering in a corner, no doubt consorting about expenses. There a clerk, 2 medical students, and a shopman what company for her. As to the women, Emma soon perceived from the tone of their voices that they must almost belong to the lowest class. Then she was frightened, pushed back her chair, and cast down her eyes. The others began to eat. She ate nothing. Her head was on fire, her eyes smarted, and her skin was ice-cold. In her head she seemed to feel the floor of the ballroom rebounding again beneath the rhythmical pulsation of the thousands of dancing feet. And now the smell of the punch, the smoke of the cigars, made her giddy. She fainted, and they carried her to the window. Day was breaking, and a great stain of purple color broadened out in the pale horizon over the St. Catherine Hills. The livid river was shivering in the wind. There was no one on the bridges. The street lamps were going out. She revived, and began thinking of Bertha asleep yonder in the servants' room. Then a cart filled with long strips of iron passed by, and made a deafening metallic vibration against the walls of the houses. She slipped away suddenly, threw off her costume, told Leon she must get back, and at last was alone at the Hotel de Boulogne. Everything, even herself, was now unbearable to her. She wished that, taking wing like a bird, she could fly somewhere far away to regions of purity, and there grow young again. She went out, crossed the boulevard, the Place Cauchois and the Faubourg, as far as an open street that overlooked some gardens. She walked rapidly, the fresh air calming her, and, little by little, the faces of the crowd, the masks, the quadrilles, the lights, the supper-nosed women, all disappeared like mists fading away. Then, reaching the Croix Rouge, she threw herself on the bed in her little room on the second floor, where there were pictures of the dirty Nestle. At 4 o'clock Hibbert awoke her. When she got home, Felicite showed her behind the clock a grey paper. She read in virtue of the seizure and execution of a judgment. What judgment? As a matter of fact, the evening before another paper had been brought that she had not yet seen, and she was stung by these words: by order of the King, Law and Justice, to Madame Bovary. Then, skipping several lines, she read, within 24 hours, without fail but what? To pay the sum of 8,000 francs. And there was even at the bottom, she will be constrained thereto by every form of law, and notably by a writ of distraint on her furniture and effects. What was to be done? In 24 hours tomorrow. Leroux, she thought, wanted to frighten her again, for she saw through all his devices, the object of his kindnesses. What reassured her was the very magnitude of the sum.